It's my journey, it's your journey. You need my help and I need yours. 'Cause we are.
Saint John Fisher, the bishop who chose Christ over the crown, in the tapestry of our Catholic faith, certain threads shine brighter, woven from courage, conviction, and an unwavering love for Christ. Among these radiant lives is Saint John Fisher, a bishop whose witness calls to us across the centuries, quietly but persistently inviting us to ask, when duty to Christ and duty to this world collide, to whom do we give our heart? Here at Journeys of Faith, our mission is deeply rooted in telling the stories of saints who stood unflinching in the face of trials, saints who remind us that the journey to Christ is marked by both suffering and surpassing hope. Saint John Fisher is one of these beacons. His life was not only a stand for the truth, but also a profound yes to Jesus in the Eucharist, a testament to the Church's unbroken teachings, and a demonstration of faith stronger than any earthly power, even the Crown of England. For centuries, faithful Catholics have drawn inspiration from the example of this scholarly bishop who refused to betray his Lord for the fleeting assurances of men. Fisher's story resonates today not just as history, but as testimony and invitation, a call for us to rekindle our own devotion to Christ, to stand for the faith in our families, our parishes, and in the daily choices that define our own journeys of faith. As we explore the life and legacy of Saint John Fisher, may his steadfast courage draw us closer to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, inspire us to greater love for the Eucharist, and remind us that the saints walk with us always, teaching us to choose fidelity over compromise, Christ over comfort, and the crown of eternal glory over the passing crowns of this world. The early life of Saint John Fisher and his call to serve. Long before Saint John Fisher would stand in defense of Christ's church with unwavering courage, he was a young boy in the market town of Beverley, Yorkshire, born in 1469 to humble parents. John's early days were marked by a deep yearning for truth and a tender piety that set him apart from his peers. His widowed mother, Margaret, raised him with gentle faith, nurturing the seeds of devotion that would one day blossom into sanctity. John's academic promise earned him a place at Cambridge, where his thirst for knowledge was matched only by his love for prayer. There, amid the Gothic spires and ceaseless prayers of scholars, young Fisher felt his soul stirred with a holy desire to serve God and his church above all else. Life at university could seduce many into ambitions of prestige or comfort, but John was different. His eyes were fixed on the crucified Lord, and his heart burned for the salvation of souls. Thus began his lifelong pattern, choosing Christ first, no matter the glory the world might offer. As he advanced through studies, he was drawn not merely to academics or debate, but to the sacred mysteries. Those who encountered him remember a scholar with sleeves rolled up to serve in the chapel, a student whose brilliance was always gentle and other-centered, a rare harmony of intellect with humility. Soon, that path of service led him to holy orders. Ordained a priest at just 22, John Fisher embraced his vocation with the zeal of the early apostles. Parish life was no mere stepping stone for him. Every Mass celebrated, every confession heard, every lesson taught was an offering of love to the Lord Jesus present in the Eucharist. In John Fisher's rising influence at Cambridge and in the wider church, we see not ambition, but a man so conformed to Christ that service became his joy even unto the cross. Walk with the saints. Deepen your faith through Saint John Fisher. Let Saint John Fisher's unwavering witness inspire your own journey of faith. At Journeys of Faith, we know that stories like his can spark renewal, courage, and deeper love for Christ and his church, even amid the challenges you face. Discover more about Saint John Fisher and other heroic saints through our lovingly crafted books, DVDs, and devotional resources. Nourish your spiritual life with materials centered on the Eucharist and the powerful intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Join our community of Catholics, united in prayer and pursuit of holiness, whether you're exploring on your own, with loved ones, or as a parish group. Find exclusive gifts and sacramentals that bring a daily reminder of Christ's presence in your life. Let our legacy of testimony and hope accompany you on your own pilgrimage of faith. Ready to dive deeper? Visit JourneySawFaith.com today to explore resources and sign up for our newsletter. Let's walk this path together, guided by the example of St. John Fisher and the radiant communion of saints, a scholar formed in truth, Cambridge, and the life of the mind. To understand St. John Fisher's heroic fidelity, we must journey back to the hallowed halls of Cambridge, where his story as a scholar and defender of the faith took root. Imagine the crisp, sacred silence of candlelit libraries, lined with ancient manuscripts and echoing the hopeful prayers of young men hungry for both wisdom and holiness. There, as a brilliant student and later as chancellor, John Fisher encountered not only the treasures of classical learning, but also the piercing call of God's truth. For Fisher, Cambridge was not merely an institution. It was a battleground for souls. As he walked its cobblestone paths, he sought to unify what so many keep apart. A mind sharpened by study and a heart set ablaze for Christ, he immersed himself in theology and philosophy, gazing always beyond the prestige of worldly honors. His lectures weren't dry recitations. Witnesses marveled at how he wove scripture, the wisdom of the fathers, and the truths of our faith into every subject. Those who heard him felt drawn into a sacred drama, one that demanded not just understanding but surrender. Each day, the Eucharist was the axis of Fisher's existence. His hunger for truth led him to daily Mass and hours absorbed in prayer, so that his scholarship was never divorced from adoration. He believed that knowledge without love of God is lifeless, that intelligence, unless illuminated by grace, cannot guide us to our final destiny. Fisher fostered a love of the Eucharist and Marian devotion among students and faculty alike, urging them to lift their eyes from textbooks to the tabernacle, from university rules to Christ's command to love. What made Fisher's academic leadership so transformative was his witness. Even as rivals and reformers pressed him to compromise, even as human respect beckoned him to take the easy road, he remained steadfast. In subtle conversations and stormy controversies alike, he held fast to the faith of the Church, inviting others, by word and by example, to let truth reign above every fleeting fashion, every earthly crown. In the crucible of Cambridge, it was not just a scholar that was formed, but a saint in the making. One who understood that the life of the mind is a bridge to the life of the soul, and that the road to heaven often winds through the classrooms and chapels of ordinary days. A shepherd of souls, Fisher as Bishop of Rochester. St. John Fisher's journey as Bishop of Rochester was never about grandeur or prestige. Appointed to this humble diocese in 1504, he embraced the smallest, poorest see in England not with reluctance, but with a pastor's zeal for God's people. His appointment might have seemed insignificant to worldly eyes, but to Fisher, every soul entrusted to his care was infinitely precious to Christ. He led with a heart ablaze for truth, devoting himself with almost monastic simplicity to prayer, penance, and generous almsgiving. Fisher never lingered in comfort. He was renowned for his tireless visitation of parishes, walking the rugged roads of Kent to check in on the sick, the lonely, and the forgotten. His episcopal palace was so modest, it barely stood out amongst the city's buildings. Yet it became a beacon of comfort for the destitute, who knew the bishop would never turn away the hungry. But it was in his love for the Eucharist and his embrace of sacramental life that John Fisher truly became a shepherd, after the heart of Christ. He insisted on reverent liturgy, carefully instructing both clergy and laity in the real presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. Witnesses often recounted how, during the Holy Mass, Fisher would pause and kneel in adoration, his eyes filled with tears of devotion at the altar. For him, the Eucharist was not mere ritual, but the living Christ present and longing to fill every wounded soul. Education, too, found its champion in Fisher. He poured himself into the spiritual and intellectual formation of priests, ensuring they would be faithful transmitters of the faith. As Chancellor of Cambridge University, he reformed studies and opened the treasures of sacred learning to all willing hearts, often drawing from his own meager resources to fund scholarships for the poor. St. John Fisher's episcopacy wasn't without suffering or opposition. He confronted the moral decay and laxity of the age with prophetic courage, calling his flock, and even the mighty, to holiness. He spoke boldly from the pulpit, not out of pride, but out of heartbreak for souls wandering far from God. In every word and action, Fisher shone as a father, a defender, and a servant, showing that authentic shepherding means laying down one's life, little by little, for love of Christ and his church. Defender of the faith against rising heresies. In turbulent 16th century England, when powerful winds of change swirled through church and society, St. John Fisher stood like a lighthouse fixed on the rock of Catholic truth. Appointed Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher quickly became renowned not only for his profound scholarship and holiness, but for a courageous candor that cut through the confusion of his age. At universities and royal courts alike, he was a beacon of clarity, a shepherd called to guard his flock as dark clouds of heresy loomed upon the horizon. As Protestant reform gained momentum on the continent, seeds of doctrinal error began to take root in England. Many churchmen, for fear or favor, preferred silence or compromise, but not Bishop Fisher. With a heart aflame for Christ in the Eucharist and a mind formed by sacred tradition, he saw the grave danger in denying ancient truths. The real presence, the necessity of the sacraments, and the authority passed down from the apostles themselves. He pored over Scripture and the writings of the Church Fathers, crafting bold defenses of the faith. On the altar, in the confessional, and through his pen, Fisher's sermons rang from pulpits with a sincerity that touched the soul, but it was his debates and writings that drew the sharpest lines. He publicly refuted those who denied Christ's sacramental presence, and in Parliament he fearlessly argued for the unity of the Church under Peter's successor. When King Henry V's desire for an annulment morphed into a defiant breach with Rome, Fisher recognized a crossroads for England, for its church, and for every soul in the land. Yet, even as threats and temptations circled him, John Fisher looked not to earthly security, but to the promise of Christ. "I am with you always," he reminded fearful hearts that the truth cannot be rewritten by kings or parliaments, but only handed down, faithful, whole, and unbroken, from one generation to the next. His testimony became a living invitation to all, to cling to Christ, come what may, even amidst the fiercest storm, standing firm in the truth of marriage, Catherine of Aragon's cause. When the winds of change swept through Henry V's England, few figures stood as steadfastly as St. John Fisher. Amidst a royal court swirling with ambition and compromise, Fisher turned his gaze not to power but to Christ. Nowhere was this more evident than in his unwavering support of Catherine of Aragon, the true and rightful queen, whose marriage to Henry became the battleground for the soul of English Catholicism. From the very outset, Fisher recognized that Catherine's cause was not just a private matter, but a defense of the sacramental dignity of marriage itself. Where others bent under the pressure of kings and courtiers, Fisher consulted the timeless teachings of the Church. He knew in his heart that Christian marriage, an indissoluble bond, raised by Christ himself to the dignity of a sacrament, was not Henry's to unravel for convenience or ambition. History tells us how Catherine suffered in silence and exile, clinging to her vocation as wife and queen. Fisher stood beside her, a lone bishop in a storm of betrayal, his conscience rooted in prayer and truth. He championed her legitimacy at great peril, faithfully defending the bond she shared with Henry as valid in the eyes of God and unbreakable according to Catholic teaching. his defense was not only intellectual but deeply pastoral. A shepherd who would not abandon his flock in their hour of need. When called to judge the king's request for annulment, Fisher declared, "I condemn no one, but I ask that justice, truth, and the rights of the church be respected." It was not the easy path. Fisher's stand cost him friends, comforts, and ultimately his freedom. Yet he drew strength from the sacramental love he defended. The same love Christ has for his church, pure, faithful, and undivided. In John Fisher's faithfulness, we glimpse the gospel come alive. A witness willing to stand against the tide for the sake of God's eternal truth. In defending Catherine of Aragon's marriage, he became a beacon, not only for his own time, but for all who struggle to reap firm when the world tries to redefine what God himself has joined. The king's great matter and a crisis of conscience. It was a time when the thunder of royal decrees could change the fate of a nation. Yet conscience knows no crown. The story of St. John Fisher reaches its grim crescendo in the shadow of Henry V's great matter, the king's fierce, stubborn desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to secure a male heir. To many, it was a personal dilemma for the sovereign. To Bishop Fisher, it was a crossroads for the soul of England, a question of fidelity not just to church law, but to Christ himself. When King Henry's envoys pressed the clergy and nobility to recognize him as supreme head of the church in England, the air around London became sharp with dread and compromise. Lines were drawn. Bishops who chose comfort kept quiet, but John Fisher stood apart, a solitary voice echoing the traditions of the apostles, unshaken by the tidal wave of royal power. He alone among his peers refused to bend, declaring in Parliament, "It is plain, madam, that your majesty has no more power to change the law of Christ than to change the course of the sun." This was not merely intellectual resistance. For Fisher, faith was flesh and blood, a living relationship with Christ and his church that could not be traded, not even for his life. How easily he might have rationalized, as many did, to keep his high station, to spare his flock, to serve God behind the scenes. But Fisher chose differently, letting his yes to Christ resound louder than his fear of the scaffold. In that defining winter of his conscience, John Fisher became a living sermon, a testament that devotion to Christ may exact a cost, but never disappoints. His witness shatters any illusion that sainthood is reserved for gentle times. Here was a shepherd willing to lose the world so as not to lose his soul. With each passing day, as the king's pressure mounted and friends deserted him, Fisher's isolation grew deeper, yet so did his certainty. In his silence, in his sorrow, in the cell where he awaited execution, he clung to the Eucharist and the hope that God brings life from suffering. For the faithful who trembled and doubted, John Fisher showed that holiness is forged and proven in crises of conscience, that to stand for the truth is to follow Christ, whatever the cost. When the crown challenged Christ, the oath of supremacy. The spring of 1534 dawned with shadows stretching long across England's sacred landscape. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of ancient churches, a quiet storm was brewing, one that would test not only the strength of stone and stained glass, but the metal of men formed by Christ. It was in this harrowed season that St. John Fisher, already revered for his holiness and learning, found himself summoned before a throne demanding homage. King Henry V's oath of supremacy was more than parchment and ink. It was a dividing line, a challenge issued to every bishop, priest, and Catholic souls in England. By this oath, all were compelled to affirm that the king, not the pope, was the supreme head of the church in England. Acceptance brought safety, position, perhaps comfort. Refusal invited suspicion, then exile, and, for some, the executioner's blade. St. John Fisher, clothed in the gentle humility that always marked his walk, stood among his peers and weighed the cost. Here was a man who loved his flock with a shepherd's heart, who cherished tradition, the Mass, and the prayers of centuries. But his obedience was to Christ first, and through him, to the vicar of Christ in Rome. When the interrogators, men tasked with enforcing loyalty to the crown, placed the oath before him, history tells us that Fisher's hand did not tremble, but neither did he raise it in assent. With a calm forged in hours before the Eucharist, with courage rising from devotion to the Blessed Mother, he bore witness, "The King, our sovereign Lord, is not, nor ever shall be, supreme head of the Church in England." The room fell silent. Heaven and earth seemed to pause. Fisher's fidelity was not rooted in politics or pride, but in a love for truth greater than the fear of suffering. He knew what it would cost. When others capitulated, he stood alone, holding fast to the rock from which his faith was hewn. In that moment, he was not merely defending a point of doctrine. He was echoing Peter's words to the Sanhedrin. "We must obey God rather than men." As the walls of the Tower of London soon closed around him, John Fisher became a living invitation for every Catholic soul. When the world asks for compromise, will we choose Christ over comfort? Will we, like Fisher, anchor our hearts in the unchanging truth of the faith even when the cost is everything? A bishop alone, courage in the face of isolation. As St. John Fisher stood firmly for Christ and the integrity of the Church, he soon discovered the steep price of true fidelity. Isolation. Imagine the halls of power in England, once familiar corridors for Bishop Fisher. Now they had grown cold and perilous. Friends counseled prudence. Colleagues slipped away in silence. Even some of his own clergy distanced themselves, fearful of royal wrath. Yet this bishop did not shrink. He prayed alone, walked alone, and, apart from a few brave souls, stood alone. The decision to uphold the sanctity of marriage and papal authority pitted him not merely against worldly power, but against an empire intent on reshaping faith to suit its own needs. Letters arrived, first with polite warnings, then with veiled threats, finally with open demands. Sign the oath, abandon your conscience, follow the king's will. But St. John Fisher was not formed by ambition or fear. His courage was the hard diamond of a soul forged in humble devotion and daily prayer. In the cold stone cell of the Tower of London, deprived of sacraments and comfort, he clung to the only friend who would never abandon him. Jesus in the Eucharist, present to him in spirit, the source and summit of his strength.
Is your journey.